making full songs with the MPC One is fully possible and fully not intuitive. So today I want to try to demystify that process a bit, show you my preferred workflow for making songs, and also how to use its song mode. So without any further introduction, let's jump into it. All right, I'm going to start with showing you how to export the individual tracks. There are a few different things to be aware of, so I'm going to walk you through all of those. And this first method is my preferred method, and it's a little more DAW-centric in terms of structuring a full song. But if you're more interested in the song mode, still stick through this because this is going to lay an important foundation that we're going to build on. Here's the beat that I'm working with. And there's quite a bit of stuff going on in both of these, quite a few layers, quite a few parts that kind of interweave with each other. So this should definitely be enough to build out a full track once I start muting and unmuting stuff in my DAW. Once again, fairly DAW-centric for this first stab at making a full song. And I should also mention, if you like some of those synth tones, some of those are recorded using Auto Sampler, and I did an entire dedicated video on how to use Auto Sampler, and I actually recorded those sounds that I'm using in this song in that video, so I'll link it at the end of this one. That being said, let me go to main, and before I do anything, I want to double check which sequence I have selected. Let's say that I want to export sequence 1, which is that main kind of future garage part. So I've confirmed that sequence 1 is selected. I can scroll through them. Sequence 1, I'm gonna hit this little folder icon right here. This will take me to a file management type window. We're gonna ignore most of this, except you can double check which sequence that you're about to export because it's bolded. Sequence 1, that's what we want. So hit export. This takes you to a window with a bunch of stuff in it. The default that it gives you is actually this, stereo output. So it'll just export an audio file of exactly what I just played for you. That's fine, that's cool, but we're gonna ignore that for now because I want the individual tracks. To do that, you're gonna hit separate programs. And I always, for good measure, just hit export returns as well. What this is going to do is it's going to export every individual big track. So all of my drums are living on one program, just one drum program, so one track essentially. Those are all going to be together, layered on top of each other. Any processing that is going on to my full drum track, that's all going to be preserved. And all of my other tracks, once again, are going to be exported as is. The benefit of this approach is that things like sidechain and stuff will get translated through this. So I've got my bass and some of my synth stuff sidechained to the kick, for instance. These settings will preserve that in the individual tracks. So my kick is sent to the ducker input, and then I've got a ducker on the bass, for instance. You can hear that. That will be preserved. I'm going to hit export. I've already done this ahead of time, so I'm not going to do it right now, but it'll go through the export process, and I should show you how to put it on a specific place. So I've got my external SD card, and I've got an exports folder that I've created. A bunch of junk in here. You probably want to create a proper new folder. You can name that, name the project, hit save, and it'll just export the individual programs. That's pretty nice. The one thing to be aware of is that you want to have your mix between individual elements fairly dialed in. So for instance, for these drums, I actually had to go back and export these again because I listened back to my full mix and my hi-hat was way too loud and the hi-hat volume was baked into that full drum track. So I had to go back, change it, and export it again. Not a huge deal, but definitely something to be aware of. But let's say that you don't want all of your drums to be just baked together onto one track. There's a solution to that as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is triple check that I've got the correct track selected. So these are the drums. You can't see me finger drumming, but you get the idea. I've got the correct track selected because if you explode the wrong track, it can give you results that you won't want. So here's how to explode a track. Hit the little pencil icon here, hit the explode button. What that did is that separated all of these pads into their own individual tracks. So now you can export everything. So there's going to be a kick track, a clap, a hi-hat, percussion. All of those individual pads are now living on completely separate tracks. To make sure that that gets translated into the export, let's go back to the file icon. I've got the correct sequence selected, hit export. And now, rather than separate programs, I'm going to select explode tracks. You have to explode in the main window, and then you have to tell it to export those exploded tracks. So that first step was basically the actual exploding of the tracks. This is just making sure that it actually exports those exploded tracks. This does remove things like sidechain and stuff being interconnected, which is a bummer. And it's why I'm sometimes kind of hesitant to do it, because it doesn't always give me the results that I want. Maybe I could just go in post and sidechain stuff. That's obviously not a big deal and pretty easy to do. So if you like having that much individual control, you can just use export tracks and then do some more mixing in post, like sidechain, more reverb and delay sends, distortion on an entire drum bus, things like that. Just be aware that explode tracks will remove a lot of the interconnectedness of a bunch of tracks. Then you go through the exact same process, hit export, maybe go to your memory card, all that kind of stuff. And then once you've done that, all you have to do is turn off your MPC, pop out the SD card and pop it into your computer and bring those tracks into your DAW. So let me show you a few things that I've done for arranging and mixing this specific song in Reaper, my DAW of choice. It looks like there's a lot going on here, and I'll get to why in a second, but essentially I've gone to that folder full of individual tracks, dragged them directly in, and then started moving them around and messing with them. Obviously, I've set my DAW to the same tempo. It's like a weird decimal one, but you get the idea. So here is this section. Later on, a proper arrangement. If I zoom it out here, you can see more of how this is laid out. So I essentially just copied and pasted a bunch of stuff across my timeline a bunch of times and then started removing elements. So I've got my little intro, and then it builds, goes into the drop, returns to the original part. So here's a key thing that I really want to show you. And this is Reaper specific, but there will almost certainly be equivalents in other DAWs. This is just how I'm doing it in Reaper. You'll notice these tracks are a bit bumped out from where these tracks are. These are kind of indented in. That's because these two tracks right here are contained within this track, which is like a folder is what they call them. What this allows me to do is consolidate elements and make them overlap, because each sound will have a tail on it. Let me give you an example with a sound that rings out quite a bit. Hear that sidechain on there? And in your export settings on the MPC itself, you probably noticed that there's a setting for an audio tail, and I set it to about a second long. And I'm fading it out just to make sure it goes to complete silence. It doesn't cut off abruptly. I want this to overlap with the next time that this loops. So I've got two separate tracks. So check this out. So as this is ringing out and ending, the next one starts. I need two separate tracks for these to overlap, but I want to be able to process them as if they're one track and have that be easy, hence folders. So let me just show you on the drums. I have soloed this folder here. Hear that little reverb tail? I want to preserve that. I don't want to cut it off abruptly. So no effects on these, but if I go to the effects for the folder, I've got a little EQ here. Just boosting some highs, nothing too crazy. And that affects both of these tracks. Super nice. And by the way, to actually set that up, you create a blank track. Let me get rid of this. So this, let's just assume it's a completely blank track, maybe with a bit of processing on it. Hit this little folder icon, boom, and that just added these tracks to this folder. By default, it'll add every single track below it to a folder. And so I have to cycle through this until this track right here is the last thing in whatever folder it's a part of. And you can even have folders within folders. You can go pretty nuts with this. I am not going to for the moment. And I've not done this for every track. Some tracks are monophonic, like the bass. That doesn't need to be overlapping in any way, so I've just left it all on one track and done my basically just EQ on here, so I could really dial in how I wanted this to sound. The one time I used Explode for this song is this little fill right here, because for the most part, I was happy with like this drum mix living all in this one track. The balance is good. There's a bit of bus processing, if I recall correctly. That was working for me. But I did do a save as on my project and do just a quick little explode because I wanted this little fill. And in order to get that, I figured, well, I just may as well explode everything. And that's something I will do sometimes with these. I'll do a normal just export on a program by program basis, and I'll do an exploded version. That way I have both ready to go, and I'll use the unexploded versions as much as I possibly can, just because it makes everything so much easier to work with. But if I need individual elements, I can just reach into that other folder. Takes just an extra few minutes up front, but it makes it a lot more convenient to work with this stuff later on. Anyway, back to the MPC. Moving on to method 2, and this is going to involve the song mode. This will take quite a bit more setup at the beginning, but it will pay off later on if you've got the patience for it. Personally, I don't like using this method as much, but it's definitely got its perks. So let me walk you through that now. First of all, I've had to go through the trouble of setting up a few separate song sections. So I've showed how I made this beat in a separate video. I'll link that at the end of this video as well. So here are the different sections that I've got, the different sequences. Little intro here. I've got a version with drums only. I've got the intro verse section. The first drop. And the second drop. Those are my basic components of the song. I should mention that for each sequence, you can go in, hit the pencil icon, and then rename it. That will come in handy later, and you've seen I've done it for a few specific sections, or sequences, rather. So like intro electric piano, intro drums, so on and so forth. For these others, I'm just kind of remembering what these contain. Now we can go into song mode. So hit menu. We've got this grid here, select song, and as you can see, I've already taken a stab at an arrangement. I'm going to do it from scratch in a second here to show you how the process works, but I just want to quickly show you the layout. You've got all of your available sequences to choose from laid out over here, and then you've got them arranged in a little playlist from top to bottom. So if I select anywhere in here, I can hit play, and it'll select that section of the song. Pretty straightforward. And if I hit play from the beginning, it'll just run through the entire thing. So now, I'm going to select a new one, turn the selection wheel to get to a new song slot, and it's empty. Now here's a really important thing, and this is something that there doesn't really seem to be much documentation on, but it's actually super straightforward to use. The easiest way to start populating this playlist of sequences is to start by hitting record, and then you can just select the sequence that you want, it'll drop it in. Select the next one, it'll drop it in after it, the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one. That's it. It's literally that easy. And then just hit record again to get out of that mode, and then you can hit record again anytime you want to add something else to the end. From there, you can start to modify which sequences you've selected if you want to change it after the fact. So for instance, let's say I want to change this sequence to be the intro electric piano. I just select this text bit, and you can see that is highlighted. Now I can use the scroll wheel once again to select a different part, and you do have to scroll to it for some reason. Just a weird little quirk of the way that this interface is laid out. So I can change what sequence is contained within each of these slots if I need to. I can change how many times it loops. So let's say that I want my first drop to loop twice. And I can even change how many bars it lasts. So I could shorten it to be 4 bars if I wanted to, for instance. So once you've gone through the effort of maybe duplicating some sequences and changing stuff up or making entirely new sequences, actually arranging them into a song is super easy. But then here's where it gets weird again. There are 2 separate ways to export this full song that we have now created. There's an easy way, and then there's a more complicated way, and they both have their pros and cons. So I'm going to show you that now. First of all, let's talk about the easy way. There is an export button right here in the song mode window. So I'm going to hit export. And you're served with a pretty similar window to what we saw before when I was doing the other individual track export. You can do the stereo output if you're happy with the song as it is, or you can do separate programs to get each separate track. However, you might notice that you can't explode the tracks. That's the big limitation of this method. You literally don't have the option to explode tracks in here. So say I've got all my drums on one track and I'm happy with the way the drums are mixed with each other, then separate programs is fine. I'll just export the separate programs. I'll have my drum track, my bass track, my vocal track, my other bass track, so on and so forth. It'll export each program separately in song mode. Super straightforward. That'll work just fine. I can hit export and go through that whole process and it'll work pretty seamlessly. If you want to be able to explode tracks in song mode, there's a bit of a workaround. First of all, you have to convert it to a sequence. Once again, if you don't need to explode tracks, you do not have to do this. But if you do want to be able to explode tracks, or if you want to be able to record a big, long audio track of, say, vocals or an instrument part over the entire song, you're going to have to do this anyway. Convert to sequence. This will take all of this and cram it into one giant sequence. So check this out. Hit that. Send it to sequence 7, because that one's not used yet. Include MIDI tracks? Sure. Hit do it. And now if I go back to main and scroll to sequence 7, it says from song 2. I'm going to hit shift and go to grid just to show you the monstrosity that I have just created. In this case, I've got my bass track selected right now. So look at this giant sequence. This is what you get. The other advantage, of course, is now I could go in and make very specific little tweaks to specific parts of the song. That's going to be fiddly and annoying to work with, so I'm absolutely not going to bother with that. But you can if you want to. Now that I've got the sequence selected, I can go to the file window and do the export process as normal. But here's a really important thing to know, and this is the biggest limitation of this method. It can only have one program assigned to it. So one program per track. In the case of this song, I have my track 4 here, and it had this bass in the main first drop of the song and the main vocal passage. In the second drop, I assigned it to this bass. It let me do that. It works between sequences, and in the first track export mode that I showed you for song mode, the export button within the song mode window, it just copes with it. It just deals with it, no problem. But if you export everything into one sequence, it has to commit to assigning one program per track. So if I was to do this again, I would make sure that track 4 has only this bass part on it, and then I would start a brand new track and then assign that other bass to it. One program per track. Each program gets its own track that it just lives on, essentially. That does require a bit of thinking ahead, but hey, now you know. And now, once again, you can go through the full export process, make sure you have that song sequence selected, go to export, and now you actually can explode tracks, which is what I did in this case. And I ended up just exporting that future bass track separately, brought it into my DAW. So let's hop into Reaper now. Here is what the exploded track looks like brought into my DAW. Once again, fully in song mode, and you'll see some adjustments here. I'll get to that in a second. Bunch of drums, and I was able to have a lot of fine control, and I ended up turning down the hi-hat a bit, for instance. Pro tip, your hi-hats are always too loud. You think they're just loud enough? Nope, they're still too loud. And that was definitely the case here. Then I've done some light EQ on a few elements, and I've done some side chaining in post, because once again, these are exploded tracks. And to be honest, I don't always like the results that the Ducker gives me anyway. And so I used basically a free equivalent to LFO tool to duck stuff manually. So for instance, here's the electric piano in the intro. Nice clean duck going on here. And that also meant that I could have another track without the ducking. So check this out. This is the one place where I like totally modified the arrangement. And I removed all the drums in this section, filtered an export of them way down, and then had this be a pretty bare bones little verse. Keep on going without some automation here. And I've got some different processing for the bass depending on the section of the song. It's a bit quieter where the vocals are present and EQ'd a bit differently. And then the drop, it's a bit louder and more present. Subtle, but it really helped the song feel a lot nicer. I was able to give each section the care it deserved, and it's already arranged, and so that process is made a whole lot easier. It's a trade-off. And I did enjoy working with it this way. I've said that I kind of don't like the song mode as much as I like the first method I showed you, and that's still true, but this did win me over just a little bit. If you'd like to see more how-tos on the MPC One, you can click or tap up over here somewhere, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching.